Hello, welcome to the Breakthrough Hiring Show. I'm your host, James Mackey. Today we have Steve Bartel back on the show. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here again. So, I would like to start off with AI. There's a lot of cool stuff that's going on with generative AI right now. And I'm really curious to, as somebody who's one of the top leaders in the recruitment space, particularly within the tech industry, I'm curious to see how Jim and just you are thinking about how talent acquisition teams are going to be leveraging AI. You mentioned that people seem to be getting really excited about using AI to reach out to do outbound sourcing essentially. So I'd be curious to learn more about that. I think all of us are, because that's probably a use case that has been talked about a lot less than, for instance, like screening inbound applicants or stuff like that.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I actually ran a survey. I surveyed my network just last week about this. And I asked them, what do you think are going to be the top use cases that drive real value, like real value for recruiting teams? And maybe that was the key word, like actual value, as to why people gravitated towards this. I expected inbound applicants, screening inbound applicants and ranking inbound applicants to be like at the top of the list, but it was actually number three. So number one, in terms of where folks thought AI would drive actual value, was for sourcing of external candidates. So that's both like finding folks, but also helping to draft the messages
Mm.
that reach out. And going back to AI use cases and what's often talked about, I do think the content creation piece is like pretty widely accepted as a place where AI is going to help. So of course, like the drafting makes sense, but actually the external finding of candidates was pretty interesting to me. For what it's worth, the use case number two, and maybe we can talk about that in a little bit, was candidate rediscovery.
Yeah, candidate discovery. I definitely want to jump into that as well. But from a sourcing standpoint, I find that really interesting. So for at least for the tech industry, right? Like a lot of the outbound sourcing, I would assume, are your customers referring to some kind of integration or some kind of extension that's sitting on top of LinkedIn Recruiter? Is that when we say outbound sourcing, is that what we mean, or how are we thinking about that?
No, actually, I think what folks want, you talk to any recruiter or sourcer, and in an ideal world, what they want is a steady stream of qualified candidates
Right.
that hit their inbox every week without the need to go into any tool and find them. And I think what folks are imagining is something that could aggregate all of the sort of publicly available data and profiles and find them folks based on the job that they're sourcing for.
Yeah, but how would the AI basically identify this? So if the AI is going outbound, I would think that the way to evaluate most candidates would be through finding their profiles on LinkedIn. I guess you could scrape different job postings, but how would they have access to those applicants unless those people came inbound to their specific company? So it seemed like if it would be leveraged for outbound sourcing, at least particularly for the tech industry, there would have to be some kind of access to LinkedIn. I'm just trying to think like what other source AI would be targeting to find a relevant person to do outreach to. Like,
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there's a lot of sources of data out there and a lot of like publicly available data. Even LinkedIn data, a lot of LinkedIn data is publicly available. And there's a whole industry around data enrichment and like data aggregators
mhm.
that all they do and all they get really good at is finding publicly available data, whether that's LinkedIn data or other data, and aggregating it into one big like database that then vendors can plug into. There's dozens and dozens of these data enrichment providers. By the way, these exist not just in the world of recruiting, they exist in sales and marketing and advertising. There's massive industries built on top of data enrichment across like all sectors.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting. I guess the primary metric there would be qualified pipe. So the sourcing quality, right? So some kind of metric to look at, okay, of candidates sourced, how many of those are converting into phone screens or making it past initial recruiter phone screens to primarily a hiring manager interview. But
Yep.
you're right. One of our customers now is a company called JUSTT, and they basically do like something, it's like a similar data aggregation. It's a totally different industry, but basically they're leveraging data, AI, and automation, and they're in the fintech space. So specifically, they do chargebacks. They help companies with chargebacks. So let's say a large online vendor like Best Buy, for instance, if somebody has something delivered and they request their money back for the product's broken or it's missing a piece or whatever else like that, they can request the money back and have it automatically. If it's under a dollar amount, the company will just refund the money immediately. And so there's a lot of fraud related to this. And it's like millions of millions. So companies like big vendors, merchants are losing like millions of dollars a year. And so basically, this company just is leveraging like a ton of different data providers to put together a persona and profile around the person requesting the chargeback to see if they've requested a ton of chargebacks to identify fraud, and then basically customize a response to the bank and to the consumer so it's this data aggregation to essentially help companies be a lot more effective and efficient, right? So I do think we're seeing like a push from like a data and AI perspective, probably across like several industries. So I think you're right here. I'm curious to learn more about the data sources and then too, like the parameters, right? Like the one thing about outbound sourcing is if we're going outbound, then we'd want to make sure that we're going outbound to people we actually want to speak to. If we like, you get, I don't know, tenure would be an obvious example. If some companies want 2+ years of experience at XYZ companies, and we want B2B complex SaaS experience, a growth stage company with 200 employees and yada yada, all that kind of stuff. We don't want to fill the recruiter pipeline with 20 phone screens of people that are not going to be quality candidates. So it's, again, like the quality of those data sources and then how AI actually filters through that appropriately to ensure the hit rate is actually good. That's going to be, of course, I think the biggest challenge. If a company can solve for that, there's obviously like a huge value add. Seems very challenging. Very hard product to build.
Agreed. That's the dream. But I think there's some good like crawl, walk, run approaches here where you can get started. And then there's going to be V2s and V3s that are more fully automated. So here's just like a few examples. So first off, I think you hit it on the head. You need to put recruiters in full control over a lot of the criteria that the AI is using to source. The cool things about LLMs, like large language models, is the way you define those criteria can be really flexible, right? You don't have to fill out a rigid like search interface. You can actually write like text prompts. Now, I think like an open-ended text prompt where the recruiter or sourcer can write anything, like that's probably not the right level of like freedom and control. You want a product that actually puts some guardrails around that. So maybe there's a prompt around location, there's a prompt around tenure. And some of those things could actually be filters and controls in the same way that you might search LinkedIn. Or you could alternatively have like a text prompt. Here's a cool example. If you want your location to be a little bit more abstract so that you don't have to enter every single city, but you can say close to this geo. That's like a more flexible way of doing a location search now using like LLMs compared to previously where you had to figure out exactly how to put those entities into the search. But that's a little bit of an aside. So if you have a way of collecting the requirements for a role across all these different dimensions and allowing the recruiter to fully control like what prompts get put in there, I think that's going to really help. So then the AI is not going rogue and sourcing a bunch of people that aren't a good fit. But you also don't want this like blank slate problem. Ideally, the AI should give you good defaults for all those prompts based on your job description, so that the recruiter's just jumping in there and saying, oh no, let's tweak these 3. But for the most part, these other 7 are right. Now, the challenge then becomes until it's calibrated, you can still reach out to a bunch of people that aren't the right fit. So I think it's really, like, and then you're talking to a bunch of people that you're like, oh shoot, like we would never hire this person. So I think there's like kind of 2 things to address that. First off, I think it's really important to do a calibration phase. The first 20 or 50 profiles that the AI finds you, let's use that to like actually get better and refine that specific search in the same way that a recruiter or sourcer would do a calibration phase with a hiring manager.
Yeah, that's what we do. So we do contract embedded RPO recruiting for tech, and we do 48 hours after a kickoff call, we do a calibration meeting. And so for each role that's assigned to us, we bring 10 profiles to the table. and do a
Yep.
share screen with the hiring manager and say, what do you like? What do you not like? Would you want to interview this person just based off their LinkedIn profile? And this is before we actually send the messages. We don't send any messages until after we
Yeah.
do the calibration. So I guess that would be one way to do it. It's just have
Exactly.
calibration, but don't have the messages sent. Make sure that the relevancy is there. And then also there could put like blockers in place, like AI can only schedule 3 interviews a week or
Right.
5 interviews a week. So there's guardrails so you don't get your calendar filled up with 20 people that aren't relevant. So there could be like
Right.
steps, calibration up front, then limit, I suppose, the number of slots that AI can fill on a weekly basis, and then
Hmm.
just slowly expand, which is like onboarding a sourcer is like the same
Exactly.
process. Yeah.
Exactly. Take exactly the same process that we use to onboard a sourcer and then build those into the. You just described the V1 of how the Gem AI is going to work. It's remarkable, James. Yeah, if you have a crystal ball into our product roadmap.
I've been in tech for too long, man. It's a decade. We've helped over 200 customers hire. Like I've
Yep.
just been doing this a minute. One question I have for you though, what if it could also be leveraged like the person, a human being is looking at all the profiles, but opposed to doing any kind of like the outreach messaging, dropping it into AI. And I guess that would be more of like a content like creation type of deal. But I'm just wondering, have you given thought to that too? Where is there a way AI could be, I don't know, that just might be like more content creation. I guess if you take
Yep.
resumes or exporting LinkedIn profiles and then
Totally.
you get a few hundred profiles and then you just drop those into some AI tool where it's leveraging, for instance, like with Gem, like email addresses and
Yep.
all that kind of stuff. I guess that would be running like large
Yes.
email campaigns with just like importing a list of candidates or something like that and just letting it run.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And actually, we already support a lot of that in the platform today,
Yeah.
where if you define the people you care about, you can leverage Gem AI to help with the draft creation. So you can have
Yeah.
much more personalized drafts and then those email campaigns with automated follow-ups that go out. But I think one thing that's going to make a lot more easy to adopt is that out of the gate, we're actually just going to have AI serve up the profiles. And then we're still going to have the sourcer and recruiter review the ones that it finds. And then that way, like you're not reaching out to somebody that it wouldn't make sense to hire. And by the way, as we do that, it's going to get better and better because we're going to feed those positive profiles back in and suggest new search criteria for you so that their search gets more and more calibrated. And then you might get to a point with a search where you're just like, hey, the last 20 people I've reviewed all look great. Let me like click this button to put it on autopilot.
Yeah. Yeah. So also though, do you start with a specific type of role? Do you start with high volume, entry level roles, or do you start saying, okay, we're only going to do this for engineering hires or SDRs? I assume I probably give this a lot more thought than me, but there's probably a use case where you feel like it's going to be a little easier to get started with this tech, prove out the value, and then there's more sophistication that's required for certain roles that might require a lot more specialization. Right. Have you thought about that? What do you think? For whatever reason, high volume entry level seems a little easier to me in a sense, but I'm wondering like within tech, like that's where it starts to get tricky. Particularly in this
Yeah,
market where hiring managers like want a very hyper specific, like now more than ever, we're getting hiring managers that are like, we want somebody that comes from this industry that's sold this specific solution. And because there's a lot of candidates on the market, it seems that if some executives they realize, okay, we can get somebody that's like hyper specific and dialed in, and that's where I feel like that like it would be the hardest to leverage AI for stuff like that. So
interestingly, AI is actually pretty good at getting the hyper specific stuff right because
well
it can
yeah
go
actually
through a super high volume of candidates and filter for those very specific criteria. I think what those hiring managers might find is that limits their talent pool a lot more than they thought. So
mm,
I think it's going to be important for the AI to be able to say, hey, look, like you've exhausted the talent pool of 30 people
yeah the
that fit
30
that
people
hyper specific
like what do you
criteria.
mean we're in New York City? It's like yeah. Oh gosh, and one of the biggest things I'm seeing now too, it's like they're getting hyper specific. You're right, they don't understand the size of the candidate pool. But the other aspect too is even when they are getting candidates, they're burning through them. Like they don't understand
Yeah.
that the pace is like front loaded. Like you might get 10 profiles or 10 people in your process in the first couple weeks, right? Because people are open to jobs right now. They're more open to taking interviews I think right now we're having a lot of luck like building pipelines quickly for customers within tech, but sometimes the searches are so hyper specific that they get 10 people and they're like, oh wow, this is great. 2, 3 weeks, like we're really building a strong pipeline. And I try to keep reminding them like, yeah, okay, you have great pipeline now, but you're going to burn through this stuff. So you got to be careful and just realize this pace is not sustainable.
Totally. And actually, that's where I think is probably the biggest limitation or risk with leveraging AI is for these more specialized roles. I think because AI can feel so automated and like it's very little work, there can probably be this temptation to just mass email a bunch of people. But if you're going after a very limited population, you actually might want to take a higher touch approach where you actually review each of those people and think about and maybe improve upon the messaging that's teed to go out to maximize your chances of connecting with them, especially if the total population for the folks that would be qualified for a role, especially if you're being very specific, is your 100 people out there, right? Because otherwise you're gonna have to go back to the drawing table and remove some of those requirements, which inevitably happens.
We have so many searches right now for customers that are just hyper specific. On our weekly check-in calls, it's okay, here's the size of the candidate pool. This is how many people we've reached out to. Here's all the follow-ups we've done. Here's the channels we've reached out on. Here's the ways we can expand the search. This is our recommendation. And it's just, man, it's constant. And so you're right. Like for us, if I have 30 people in a market for a hybrid role with a super specific skill set, it's just a manual process, right? We're just literally going through every profile. And I don't think we would leverage AI for those types of roles, honestly. I think we probably just do that ourselves.
Imagine if AI could help you find those 30, 50 people to save you the time of pouring through 10,000 people to find those hyper specific profiles. And then you can take the time to do what you do best of like actually figuring out how to personalize and like connect with those folks. And then potentially AI could be like, hey, look, if you drop this one constraint from your search criteria, that would open you up to, from 50 people, that would open up your total pool to 500. And it can know that because it actually has canvassed all those people. And then that helps you show up as a strategic partner to your hiring manager and say, hey, are you open to dropping this one constraint? It seems like a nice to have. If we do that, we can 10x the available talent.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think I had an initial question, then I rambled on with a bunch of other stuff. Is there like a specific role or function where?
Yes.
Yeah,
good question. Yes, I think you're right. You hit it on the head. I think it's, for starters, like AI is going to be most effective at like evergreen roles where there's a pretty big talent pool for them, roles where you're going to be hiring a lot of those folks. So good examples are like software engineers, entry level.
You were going to go there.
Yeah, totally. Entry level roles, SDRs, account executives, unless it's like enterprise account executives with very specific deal.
I got so much of that going on right now. It's just driving me crazy.
I know, but like on the flip side, like a head of trust and safety with very specific criteria, that might not be the right role to throw like a big AI sourcing
or like executive search.
Right.
Too much automation around that stuff.
Totally. And maybe AI could still help canvas the market and help you put together that docket of 30, 50 people that
exactly.
Like
how much available criteria. Talent do we have? That like kind of talent insights perspective where it's helping in the planning phase, I think is another huge value proposition, right? Like how can we pull in a bunch of data in the prep process? It's like the whole understanding of like most of the work occurs before the search opens. I remember particularly during COVID, we lost so much revenue. At one point I was billing myself out as a head of delivery for an applicant tracking system called Comeet. It's still out there. I don't know if you've heard of Comeet, but they work with a lot of SMBs, early stage companies, and they wanted to roll out like a fractional embedded recruiting model alongside their applicant tracking system where like basically customers could click a button and then they could engage this on-demand service. So I was running delivery for that company. I took on another CPO role for another company. And then I was doing like fractional head of TA for another company. It was nuts. Basically, one of the first things I would implement, like when I would go into a new company, is like, what is your pre-job opening process? So what steps do you have to take prior to a role being open? And
Yep.
we ended up developing like a 9-step process. It was like pretty robust. In order for a hiring manager to actually open the role, there was a lot of things that we required that go into planning, because I always said like most of the work actually happens up front. And if we structure things in the right way, we'll have a lot of momentum going into the search. And then we also had guardrails in place even once the search was open, where if criteria changed so much, we'd actually it would require the role to be closed, and we had to restart that initial onboard that process ahead of time. And so I think it's like we look at every role as an investment, and to make an investment we have to have data, and we need to understand really what we're getting ourselves into. And yeah, I think that there could be definitely a large use case for talent insights prior to roles being opened, and having that part of like potentially even approval processes before roles are open, to really understand, okay, what's the investment we're making, how much time, resources, and then also that can also help plan like capacity. Like, where are the
Yep.
bottlenecks going to occur? Are we going to need coordinators because it's high volume and we're going to have a ton of candidates in process? Do we need sourcers because it's a harder role to source for and we're not going to
Right.
necessarily have enough people in process? Do we need like more full life cycle recruiters because these are like more senior strategic roles? And how do we think about segmenting that team? How many hours of interviewing are going to go into that? How much time is going to be required from the hiring managers? Do the hiring managers have enough time to support the hiring plan? There's like a lot of talent insights when it comes to, I
Mm,
think, capacity planning, and then also the size of the talent pool. All this stuff can be done up front. And quite honestly, it is quite a manual process that requires years and years of experience in tech. I'm just thinking about the application from like a talent executive perspective, because like I spend a lot of time in spreadsheets putting together capacity plans and proposals for customers on the amount of headcount they're going to need for the talent acquisition team in order to deliver on their hiring plan.
yep.
And it goes into like everything about hours required, different roles, responsibilities, where the bottlenecks are going to likely occur based on the types of roles that they're hiring for. It's like really robust stuff, but it's a process that takes me like hours to
Right.
put
Right.
together. Like, I have to request a ton of information, and it's just very time intensive. And so I think that there would be a very beneficial use case there that should be leveraged even prior to, not even just to correct course once a role's open, to say, hey, here's how we could change the criteria. It's to have a lot of those insights up front would be my dream as a talent acquisition executive, quite honestly.
Totally. And I think this is where AI combined with a very strategic search firm or RPO or staffing agency
Or
could,
internal teams, right?
or internal, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But we need to take the recruiting expertise of a firm like yours and embed that and hopefully help automate a lot of the busy work of collecting the data and doing the research, and then have you make sense of it, that talent pool, and then show up as a trusted partner to the hiring manager.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really interesting use case. And we also wanted to touch on leveraging AI to find candidates that are already in the database, which I don't know if this is like a similar process out. It's like easier because you already have all this data in the system. Is there anything we
Right.
want to dive deeper in on that topic?
Yeah, I thought it was just interesting. I thought it was
Right.
interesting that these two use cases showed up above inbound ranking and matching, just
Yeah.
because like for the last 5 years, I think a lot of people have been talking about inbound ranking and matching. And so to see these two use cases get almost like 2 to 3x the number of like votes in this poll that I ran was just really surprising to me. And I think that it shows potentially like the power of like generative AI and like some of the new things that it's unlocking compared to what was possible before. But yeah, no, I think people are really excited about that, because especially for larger enterprise organizations that have millions of applicants in their ATS, and if they've been leveraging a CRM for some time, they might actually have even more records in their CRM between all of the people they've ever sourced that they've identified could be a good fit for their company, people who have attended events, people who have subscribed to talent communities, right? All of these different places of collecting these talent relationships. So the idea that when we open up a search, AI could first take a look at all the people that have engaged with our company, our brand, all of the hand raisers, plus all the people that their team has identified could be a good fit through sourcing historically, versus going out and sourcing cold. Intuitively, I think that just really resonates
Yeah,
with a lot of the market.
makes a lot of sense to me. And so one other application I wanted to talk about, like the AI note takers, where basically there's tools popping up where it's essentially putting together kind of high level data points from an interview and then basically structuring it so you have better notes. One of the issues that I think every talent acquisition executive and recruiter has is getting hiring managers to fill out evaluation forms after an interview.
Right.
It's just a total pain, right? Because hiring managers, like a lot of the times, their capacity when being measured by executive teams doesn't take into consideration the amount of time it takes them to hire. So it's like they have a full plate just based on the core function that they're running, but then sometimes upward of 50% of their time needs to be used for talent acquisition. And there's just not enough time in the day. There is, so it's, we try to do things like say, hey, you just jump off the interview 5 minutes before the end of the time block, fill out your evaluation, because then it's been 2 days, they forget 80% of what they talked about, right? and then all you have is, do you want to move the person forward or not? And that's
Yeah.
basically the level of insight. So I wonder, from a evaluation perspective, if it not only can take notes, but if we can get to the point where the AI kind of ranks the candidate and helps accelerate the evaluation, where maybe it's even just putting together a draft where a hiring manager can just like review and click yes versus filling out all the evaluation criteria. That might also be an interesting use case. So if we don't hear back from a hiring manager, we can at least look at the evaluation, the note taker, check that based on what we're looking for in the role, and then we can move people forward in the process without getting a form filled out, right, in Gem or Greenhouse or whatever applicant tracking system a company's using.
Totally. And I think this use case sounds really promising to me. It's one that we're paying close attention to as we bring our ATS that we just brought to market a few quarters ago up market, because I think especially for larger companies where you have a pretty extended interview loops, your hiring manager is super busy. That resonates with me. When I was at Dropbox, I was spending 50+% of my time at any given time on hiring. And it was like, who knew being an eng manager was going to be actually half 50% recruiter, right?
Half your job
really
is based on something you have no formal training with. That's also the part that's hilarious to me. It's like we're hiring these leaders and it's okay, what's their engineering background or what's their revenue background? And they have experience XYZ. But then it's like half their job's hiring, and we're not vetting for that when we're actually hiring these executives, right? Like it's just kind of funny. It's like a big miss. It's a huge miss on a lot of the times, right?
That really resonates with me. But I think your point around like summarizing the interview notes, even that takes a lot of time, like writing up notes, and you can't really be present. So I think interviewers, if they're jotting down as notes in real time, maybe they're not showing up in the way they would want to. So I think even speech to text, that has gotten like way better in the last year or two through generative AI. And the cool thing is there's like a precedent for this in the world of sales with companies like Gong in terms of like recording sales calls. And man, we use Gong internally. When I go into Gong and I see the magic that exists in terms of being able to nearly perfectly transcribe calls and then summarize them into an 8-point outline with the key takeaways, action items, I'm like, holy cow, yeah, of course, this is going to revolutionize recruiting. The exact same tech would be helpful. I think the thing we need to be really mindful of in recruiting is anything that starts to evaluate and assess candidates, we want to be careful of, because AI can bring bias into the process. After all, it's trained across a lot of human data, and humans have bias, right? So I think the key with anything related to AI in like hiring decision making is to like be really thoughtful about how you build that technology. And actually legally, you have to get that audited in a number of states, like New York, for example. So any vendor that's building that into the hiring process would actually have to get that audited. Now, if you're just taking notes and like summarizing the call, I think that's totally fine. But as soon as you're recommending an assessment, move forward or don't, like that's when you want to be extra careful. But honestly, if it was just taking notes and summarizing a bunch of the key points that came up, that'd be huge. And also like that might help with the problem of hiring managers taking 2-3 days to fill out their feedback. First of all, they might be a lot faster if a lot of the notes are taken for them and summarized for them.
I would hope so, but I still feel like perfect notes summarizing everything, they're still going to take 5 days to fill it, to hit click.
But here's the brilliant thing is even if it takes them a few days, sure, it's not going to be as high quality in terms of them being able to write their assessment, but they're going to have all these great notes they can refer back to.
Yeah, so they at least know like which candidate is which. We had a customer, man, where we had one of the searches for the same role within the company. We had 3 people named Michael in the
Oh
search.
no.
It's like we ran a LinkedIn search and put Michael in a keyword. It was just ridiculous. So we're like putting in Slack, like, to be like, hey everyone, we have 3 candidates named Michael in the process, so let's refer to everybody by last name. There's just stuff like that where it's like having the notes are so important because you don't want hiring managers to confuse people, right?
Totally. And then also just to forget a lot
Yeah,
about what was talked about, and
right.
having those notes is really good for like recalling, oh, that's what was said, that's what was talked about. Now I remember this is how I felt about whether they'd be a good fit. This has been awesome, man. I love the conversation around AI. I think it's going to be game changing for the industry. And yeah, looking forward to talking more soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Me as well. And thank you for everybody tuning in. We'll talk to you later.